The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Windsor Castle as 8-year-old Prince George walked quietly beside his protection officer, Sergeant Michael Harrison. The royal residence buzzed with its usual activity, but something felt different today. George had noticed it in the way the staff whispered among themselves, their conversations stopping abruptly whenever he approached. Sergeant Harrison had been George's primary bodyguard for 3 years now, ever since the young prince started attending school regularly. Unlike the other protection officers who maintained strict professional distance, Harrison had developed a genuine bond with the boy. He would point out interesting birds during their garden walks, share stories about his own childhood, and even help George with his football kicks when no one was watching. George trusted Harrison completely. The sergeant had a kind face with gentle brown eyes that crinkled when he smiled, which was often when they were together. His uniform was always perfectly pressed, his posture straight and alert, but he never made George feel like he was under surveillance. Instead, Harrison made the young prince feel safe and understood. That Tuesday morning started like any other. George was scheduled to visit the stables with his grandfather, King Charles, to see the new foal that had been born the previous week. Harrison walked a respectful distance behind as they made their way through the castle's corridors, his trained eyes constantly scanning for any potential threats while maintaining the relaxed atmosphere George needed. As they approached the stable entrance, George noticed his grandfather speaking in hushed tones with Sir Edmund Fitzroy, the castle's head of security. The conversation seemed serious, and both men wore expressions that George had learned to recognize as adult worry. His grandfather's face looked more lined than usual, and Sir Edmund kept glancing around nervously. George pretended not to notice their conversation, but his young mind was already working to piece together the fragments he could hear. Words like reassignment, protocol review, and immediate effect drifted toward him on the morning breeze. His stomach began to feel heavy with a growing sense that something important was happening, something that might affect the people he cared about. When they reached the stables, King Charles greeted his grandson with his usual warm smile, but George could see the effort behind it. His grandfather was trying to act normal, but there was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there during their breakfast together just an hour earlier. "Good morning, George," the king said, placing a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Are you ready to meet our newest resident?" George nodded enthusiastically, but kept stealing glances at Harrison, who had positioned himself near the stable entrance. The sergeant's usual relaxed demeanor seemed slightly strained, and George noticed he was checking his phone more frequently than normal. The new foal was beautiful, with a coat the color of rich chocolate and bright, curious eyes. George spent the next half hour learning about caring for young horses, asking his grandfather questions about breeding and training. But even as he petted the soft nose of the foal and listened to his grandfather's explanations, part of his attention remained focused on Harrison. The sergeant stood quietly at his post, but George could see something was troubling him. Harrison's jaw was set in a way George had never seen before, and his hands, usually relaxed at his sides, were clenched into loose fists. When their eyes met briefly, Harrison managed a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes the way it usually did. After the stable visit, as they walked back toward the main castle, George made a decision that would change everything. Instead of heading directly to his next scheduled activity, a tutoring session with his French teacher, he stopped walking and turned to face Harrison directly. "Sergeant Harrison," George said, his young voice carrying a note of authority that surprised even himself. "May I speak with you privately for a moment?" Harrison looked momentarily confused, glancing toward King Charles, who had paused a few steps ahead. The king gave a slight nod, understanding that his grandson needed a moment with his protection officer. "Of course, Your Highness," Harrison replied, though George could hear uncertainty in his voice. They stepped into a small alcove near the castle's ancient stone walls, away from the ears of other staff members and security personnel. George looked up at Harrison, studying the man's face carefully. He had inherited his mother's ability to read people's emotions, and he could see that Harrison was struggling with something significant. "You're leaving, aren't you?" George asked directly, his voice steady despite the worry growing in his chest. Harrison's composure faltered for just a moment, his professional mask slipping enough for George to see the pain underneath. The sergeant had been dreading this conversation, hoping he might be able to complete his reassignment without having to explain the situation to the young prince. "Your Highness? Harrison began, then stopped, clearly struggling to find the right words. He had been instructed to keep the details of his reassignment confidential, but looking down at George's earnest face, he felt the weight of their friendship. "Is it because of something I did?" George pressed, his young mind immediately assuming responsibility. "Did I get you in trouble somehow?" The question hit Harrison like a physical blow. The idea that this innocent child might blame himself for the political machinations and protocol reviews that had led to this moment made his chest tighten with emotion. "No, George," Harrison said softly, forgetting the formal address in his distress. "You've done nothing wrong, nothing at all. You're the best part of this job, and that's the truth." George stepped closer, his small hand reaching out to touch Harrison's arm. The gesture was simple, but it carried the weight of genuine concern and affection. In that moment, Harrison realized that the young prince wasn't just asking out of curiosity. He truly cared about what happened to the people in his life. "Then why are you sad?" George asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can see it in your eyes. You don't want to go, do you?" Harrison looked down at the boy, seeing not just a royal heir, but a child who had come to trust him, who had shared jokes and fears and small victories over the past 3 years. The weight of leaving felt suddenly overwhelming. "Sometimes, Your Highness, adults have to make decisions that don't feel right, but are considered necessary," Harrison explained carefully. "There are rules and procedures that even I have to follow, even when I don't agree with them." George processed this information with the seriousness that had always impressed the adults around him. Even at 8 years old, he understood that the world of royalty was complicated, filled with invisible rules and expectations that didn't always make sense but couldn't be ignored. "When?" George asked simply. "Tomorrow morning," Harrison admitted, the words feeling heavy on his tongue. The silence that followed stretched between them, filled with the weight of an ending neither of them wanted. George looked up at Harrison, his young mind already working through possibilities and consequences. He had been raised to understand duty and protocol, but he had also been taught that sometimes the right thing to do wasn't the easiest thing to do. "Sergeant Harrison," George said finally, his voice taking on a tone that reminded Harrison powerfully of the boy's father, Prince William. "Would you walk with me to the garden? I'd like to see the roses before my next lesson." Harrison nodded, relieved to have something concrete to focus on. They walked in companionable silence toward the garden, but George's mind was racing. He was beginning to form a plan, something that would require courage and careful timing. As they reached the rose garden, George paused to smell a particularly beautiful bloom, but his attention was really focused on the groundskeeper who was working nearby. The groundskeeper, an elderly man named Thomas who had worked at the castle for over 40 years, looked up as they approached. He had watched George grow up and had always been impressed by the young prince's kindness and genuine interest in the people who worked around him. "Good afternoon, Your Highness," Thomas said, straightening up and wiping his hands on his gardening apron. "Hello, Thomas," George replied warmly. "The roses are beautiful this year. You've done wonderful work." The compliment brought a smile to Thomas's weathered face. "Thank you, Your Highness. It's been a good growing season." As George chatted with Thomas about the different varieties of roses and their care, Harrison watched the interaction with growing amazement. The young prince wasn't just being polite, he was genuinely interested in Thomas's work, asking detailed questions about soil preparation and pruning techniques. What Harrison didn't realize was that George was also listening carefully to the sounds around them. He could hear footsteps approaching from the direction of the castle, and he recognized the measured pace of Sir Edmund Fitzroy. The head of security was likely coming to find them, probably to begin the formal process of transitioning Harrison's duties to his replacement. George made his decision. As Sir Edmund came into view around the corner of the garden path, George did something that would be talked about in the castle for years to come. He stepped closer to Harrison and, in a voice loud enough for Sir Edmund and Thomas to hear clearly, made a simple but powerful statement. "Sergeant Harrison, you've taught me that real protection comes from trust and friendship, not just following rules. I hope whoever makes decisions about our security team remembers that some things are more important than procedures." The words hung in the air like a challenge, spoken with the innocent directness that only a child could manage, but carrying the unmistakable weight of royal opinion. Sir Edmund stopped in his tracks, his face paling as he realized the implications of what he had just heard. George had just publicly praised Harrison's service and subtly questioned the wisdom of his reassignment, all while maintaining the appearance of a casual conversation in the garden. It was a masterful piece of diplomacy that would have impressed seasoned politicians, executed by an 8-year-old who simply wanted to protect someone he cared about. The game had changed, and everyone present knew it. Sir Edmund Fitzroy stood frozen on the garden path, his mind racing as he processed what had just happened. In his 25 years of service to the royal family, he had never encountered a situation quite like this. The young prince had just delivered what amounted to a diplomatic protest, wrapped in the innocent words of a child, but carrying unmistakable royal authority. Harrison felt his heart skip a beat as he realized what George had done. The boy had just publicly defended him in front of the head of security, using language that was both respectful and pointed. It was a move that could either save his position or make the situation much more complicated for everyone involved. Thomas, the groundskeeper, unaware of the full context but sensing the tension in the air, quietly excused himself and moved to a different section of the garden. He had worked at the castle long enough to recognize when he was witnessing something significant, and he knew better than to linger when royal business was being conducted. Sir Edmund approached slowly, his usual confident stride replaced by careful, measured steps. He was trying to calculate the best way to handle this unexpected development. Protocol demanded that he proceed with Harrison's reassignment as planned. But the prince's public statement had created a delicate situation that required careful navigation. "Your Highness," Sir Edmund said, offering a respectful bow to George, "I trust you're enjoying your visit to the garden this morning." George looked up at Sir Edmund with eyes that seemed far older than his 8 years. "Yes. Thank you, Sir Edmund. Sergeant Harrison was telling me about the importance of consistency in security work. He said that when people work well together, it creates the strongest protection." The statement was delivered with perfect innocence, but its meaning was crystal clear to everyone present. George was making a case for keeping his security team intact, using Harrison's own professional language to support his argument. Sir Edmund cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Indeed, Your Highness. Consistency is certainly valuable in our line of work." Harrison watched this exchange with growing amazement. George was conducting what amounted to a diplomatic negotiation, using techniques that would have impressed foreign ambassadors. The boy was staying within the bounds of respectful behavior while making his position absolutely clear. "Sir Edmund," George continued, his voice taking on the same tone he used when discussing serious topics with his parents, "may I ask you something about how security decisions are made?" The question caught Sir Edmund off guard. He couldn't very well refuse to answer a direct question from a member of the royal family, but he also couldn't discuss the confidential details that had led to Harrison's reassignment. "Of course, Your Highness. What would you like to know?" George stepped closer to a beautiful rose bush, running his small fingers gently over a pink bloom as he spoke. "When someone does good work and makes everyone feel safe and happy, why would that person need to be moved to a different job?" The question hung in the air like a sword, sharp and precise despite its simple wording. Sir Edmund felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead as he searched for an appropriate response. "Well, Your Highness, sometimes changes are made for various administrative reasons or to give people new experiences and challenges," Sir Edmund said carefully. George nodded thoughtfully, as if considering this explanation seriously. That makes sense for some jobs, but what if the person doesn't want new experiences? What if they're happiest doing the job they already have? And the people they protect are happiest with them too? Harrison had to bite the inside of his cheek to keep from smiling. George was systematically dismantling every possible justification for the reassignment, using logic that was both unassailable and impossible to argue against without appearing unreasonable. Sir Edmund was beginning to realize that he was outmatched. The young prince had inherited more than just his position. He had clearly inherited the strategic thinking and diplomatic skills that had served the royal family for generations. "Your Highness raises some excellent points," Sir Edmund said slowly. "Perhaps this would be a good topic to discuss with your father and grandfather." George's eyes lit up with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. "What a wonderful idea, Sir Edmund. Shall we go speak with them now?" "I believe my grandfather is in his study, and my father should be arriving for lunch soon." Sir Edmund felt a growing sense of panic. The last thing he wanted was to explain to the King and the Prince of Wales why he was reassigning a popular and effective security officer against the expressed wishes of the young prince. The political implications were becoming more complex by the minute. "Perhaps we should schedule a more formal meeting to discuss these matters," Sir Edmund suggested, hoping to buy time to figure out how to handle the situation. But George was not about to let the momentum slip away. "Oh, but I'm sure they won't mind if we just stop by for a quick chat. They always say I should feel free to ask questions about things that are important to me." As they walked back toward the castle, George maintained a steady stream of conversation that appeared casual, but was actually carefully designed to reinforce his position. He talked about how much he had learned from Harrison, how safe the sergeant made him feel, and how much he valued the continuity in his daily routine. Harrison walked behind them, still amazed by what he was witnessing. The young prince was conducting a master class in gentle persuasion, never raising his voice or showing any sign of upset, but making his position absolutely clear to everyone around him. When they reached the castle's main entrance, they encountered Princess Anne, George's great-aunt, who was just returning from her morning ride. She dismounted her horse and handed the reins to a waiting groom, her sharp eyes immediately picking up on the tension in the group. "Good morning, George," she said warmly, then nodded to Sir Edmund and Harrison. "Gentlemen," George's face brightened genuinely at the sight of his great-aunt. Princess Anne had always been one of his favorite relatives, known for her direct manner and no-nonsense approach to royal duties. "Aunt Anne!" George exclaimed. "Perfect timing. We were just discussing how important it is to keep good people in the jobs where they do their best work." Princess Anne raised an eyebrow, her experienced eye immediately recognizing that she was walking into something significant. "Were you indeed? And what brought on this discussion of employment philosophy?" George glanced meaningfully at Harrison, then back at his great-aunt. "Well, someone mentioned that Sergeant Harrison might be getting moved to a different job, even though he's absolutely brilliant at the one he has now. I was trying to understand the reasoning behind that kind of decision." Princess Anne's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. She had been around royal politics long enough to recognize when bureaucratic decisions were about to create unnecessary drama. She also knew that George was not asking idle questions. "I see," she said slowly, her gaze moving from George to Sir Edmund. "And what did you learn about this reasoning?" Sir Edmund found himself in the uncomfortable position of being questioned by two members of the royal family, one of whom was known for her sharp tongue and intolerance for foolish decisions. "Your Royal Highness, we were discussing the general principles of personnel management," he said carefully. Princess Anne studied him for a moment, then looked down at George with something that might have been amusement in her eyes. "George, dear, why don't you tell me more about what makes Sergeant Harrison so good at his job?" George launched into a detailed explanation of Harrison's qualities, speaking with the enthusiasm of a child, but the precision of someone who had been paying very close attention. He talked about Harrison's ability to make him feel safe without making him feel restricted, the sergeant's knowledge of security procedures, and his skill at balancing protection with the normal activities of childhood. As George spoke, Princess Anne watched Sir Edmund's face carefully. She could see the man's growing discomfort and realized that whatever bureaucratic reasoning had led to the reassignment decision was probably not going to survive scrutiny from the family. "Well," Princess Anne said when George finished his explanation, "it sounds like Sergeant Harrison is exactly the sort of person we want looking after our young prince. Sir Edmund, I trust you'll take George's observations into consideration when making your final decisions." The phrase "final decisions" carried just enough emphasis to make it clear that Princess Anne expected those decisions to align with George's preferences. Sir Edmund nodded stiffly. "Of course, Your Royal Highness. All relevant factors will be considered." George beamed up at his great-aunt. "Thank you, Aunt Anne. I knew you would understand how important these things are." As they parted ways in the castle's entrance hall, George turned to Harrison with a smile that was both innocent and triumphant. "Sergeant Harrison, shall we head to my French lesson now?" "I have a feeling it's going to be a very good day for learning." Harrison followed the young prince down the hallway, his mind reeling from what had just transpired. In the space of 30 minutes, George had orchestrated a campaign that had effectively saved his job, all while maintaining perfect royal decorum and never once appearing to challenge authority directly. The 8-year-old had just taught everyone present a lesson in the power of gentle persistence and strategic thinking. And somehow, Harrison suspected this was only the beginning of what would prove to be a very interesting day. Word of George's diplomatic intervention spread through the castle with remarkable speed. By lunchtime, nearly everyone on staff had heard some version of the story about how the young prince had quietly but effectively challenged a security reassignment. The details varied depending on who was telling the tale, but the core message remained consistent. Prince George had stood up for someone he cared about. In the royal dining room, King Charles and Prince William sat across from each other at the polished mahogany table, their conversation focused entirely on the morning's events. Sir Edmund had briefed them both on the situation, though his account had been notably lacking in specific details about George's sophisticated diplomatic maneuvering. "So let me understand this correctly," Prince William said, setting down his cup of tea with deliberate precision. "An 8-year-old boy has effectively overruled a security decision by conducting what amounts to a public relations campaign." King Charles chuckled softly, a sound that held both pride and amazement. "It appears that your son has inherited more than just his position, William. He's displaying political instincts that would serve him well in Parliament." Prince William shook his head in wonder. "Catherine is going to find this absolutely fascinating. She's always said that George thinks about things differently than other children his age. The question now," King Charles continued, "is how we handle this situation. Sir Edmund is clearly uncomfortable with having his authority questioned, even indirectly. But George has raised legitimate points about continuity and effectiveness in his security detail. Before Prince William could respond, there was a soft knock on the dining room door. A footman entered and announced that Prince George was asking to speak with both his father and grandfather about an important matter concerning fairness and good judgment. The two men exchanged glances, both recognizing that George was not finished with his campaign. Prince William gestured for the footman to send George in, curious to see how his son would approach this next phase of his diplomatic mission. George entered the dining room with his usual polite confidence, but both men could see that he was carrying himself with a slightly more formal bearing than usual. He was treating this as an official audience, and his demeanor reflected that understanding. "Good afternoon, Papa." "Good afternoon, Granddad," George said, offering a small bow that was perfectly executed. "Good afternoon, George," King Charles replied warmly. "We understand you wanted to discuss something important with us." George nodded seriously. "Yes, please. I've been thinking about something all morning, and I believe it's important enough to bring to your attention." Prince William gestured to a chair beside him. "Please sit down and tell us what's on your mind." George took his seat but remained sitting straight, his hands folded properly in his lap. "I wanted to talk to you about the difference between following rules and doing what's right." The statement caught both men off guard. They had expected George to make a direct plea for Harrison's job, but instead he was opening with a philosophical discussion that suggested much deeper thinking about the situation. "That's a very sophisticated topic, George," King Charles said carefully. "What is you thinking about such things?" George looked directly at his grandfather, his young face serious but not upset. "This morning I learned that sometimes adults make decisions based on rules and procedures, even when those decisions might not be the best for the people involved. I wanted to understand when rules should be followed and when they should be questioned." Prince William felt a surge of pride mixed with concern. His son was asking questions that went to the heart of leadership and moral decision-making, topics that most children his age never considered. "Can you give us a specific example of what you mean?" Prince William asked. George took a deep breath. "Sergeant Harrison is being moved to a different job, not because he's done anything wrong, but because of some administrative rule or procedure. But he doesn't want to leave, and I don't want him to go. And everyone who works with him says he's excellent at his job." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "So I'm trying to understand why a rule or procedure should be more important than keeping good people in jobs where they make everyone safer and happier." King Charles leaned back in his chair, impressed despite himself. "George, you're asking one of the most important questions that anyone in a position of authority ever has to consider. Sometimes rules exist for good reasons we can't immediately see, and sometimes rules need to be reconsidered when circumstances change." "But who decides which situation we're in?" George asked. "Who gets to say whether a rule should be followed or changed?" Prince William exchanged a meaningful look with his father. George wasn't just advocating for Harrison anymore. He was asking fundamental questions about power, responsibility, and decision-making that would serve him well throughout his future role. "In our family, George, those decisions ultimately rest with the people who bear responsibility for the consequences," King Charles explained. "Your father and I have to make difficult choices about many things, including the security arrangements that keep our family safe." George nodded thoughtfully. "So if you and Papa decided that keeping Sergeant Harrison was better for our family's safety and happiness than following the procedure to move him, you could make that choice?" "Theoretically, yes," Prince William said slowly, beginning to see where his son was leading the conversation. George's eyes brightened slightly. "Then may I tell you why I think keeping Sergeant Harrison would be the better choice?" For the next 10 minutes, George presented what amounted to a formal case for Harrison's retention. He spoke about the importance of trust in security relationships, the value of continuity in a child's daily routine, and the effectiveness that comes from team members who genuinely care about their work. He cited specific examples of Harrison's excellent judgment and discussed how the sergeant's approach to protection had helped him feel both safe and normal. Throughout his presentation, George maintained perfect composure and spoke with a clarity that would have impressed university debating societies. He never once pleaded or became emotional. Instead, he built a logical argument based on practical considerations and measurable outcomes. When he finished, both King Charles and Prince William sat in thoughtful silence for several moments. Finally, King Charles spoke. "George, that was an exceptionally well-reasoned argument. You've clearly given this matter serious consideration, and you've presented your case with admirable maturity." "Thank you, Granddad," George replied. "Does that mean you'll consider changing the decision about Sergeant Harrison?" Prince William smiled at his son's directness. "George, we'll need to discuss this with the appropriate people and review all the factors involved. But I can promise you that your concerns will be given serious weight in those discussions." George nodded, seemingly satisfied with this response. "Thank you, Papa. I understand that important decisions take time and careful thought." As George left the dining room, King Charles and Prince William sat in amazed silence. Finally, Prince William shook his head and laughed softly. "Father, I think we need to start preparing for a future king who's going to be much more hands-on than we anticipated." 2 days later, Sir Edmund Fitzroy found himself in the uncomfortable position of reversing a decision he had already announced. The reassignment order for Sergeant Harrison was quietly withdrawn, replaced with a commendation for excellent service, and a renewed assignment to continue as Prince George's primary protection officer. The official explanation spoke of operational efficiency and successful team dynamics, but everyone involved knew the real reason for the change. A young prince had demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful action is the gentlest one, and that true leadership often means standing up for what's right, even when it would be easier to stay quiet. Harrison received the news with profound gratitude, though he was careful to maintain his professional demeanor. When he thanked George privately, the young prince simply smiled and said, "Good people should be able to keep doing good work. That just makes sense." The incident became something of a legend within the royal household, often cited as an example of how even the youngest member of the family could demonstrate wisdom and principled leadership. Staff members would sometimes reference pulling a Prince George when they meant standing up for something important in a respectful but effective way. For George himself, the experience served as an early lesson in the power that came with his position and the responsibility to use that power thoughtfully. He had learned that influence didn't require raised voices or dramatic gestures. Sometimes the most effective tool was simply asking the right questions and trusting that reasonable people would reach reasonable conclusions. Sergeant Harrison continued to serve as George's protection officer for many years afterward, their relationship growing stronger as George matured. The sergeant often reflected that working with the young prince had taught him as much about leadership and courage as he had hopefully taught George about security and trust. Years later, when George had grown into a young man preparing for his future role as king, he would sometimes think back to that day in the rose garden when he had first learned that doing the right thing sometimes required taking a stand. The lesson had shaped his approach to leadership ever since, that true authority comes not from demanding obedience, but from inspiring others to be their best selves and creating environments where good people can do good work. The subtle yet powerful action that had saved Harrison's job had rippled out into something much larger, a defining moment that revealed the character of a future king and set the tone for a lifetime of principled leadership. It was a reminder that sometimes the most important victories are the quiet ones, won not through force, but through the simple courage to speak truth with kindness and to stand up for what matters most.